Did Israel really use Hamas to derail the Oslo peace process and kill the two-state solution? Well, I'm Robert Inlakesh, and over a year into the Gaza genocide, the Hamas movement that leads the armed resistance against Israel's assault is still misunderstood. In light of media mischaracterizations, we continue to see Hamas compared to ISIS, blamed for Israel's actions, and there are those who even say Israel created and continues to control the group. A few weeks ago, we published part 1 of this video series where I explained the origins of Hamas, separating fact from fiction, regarding the funding of the group, its historical climate, and how it emerged as the most popular Islamic party in Palestine. So, in this video, I'll seek to explain what's wrong with the argument that Hamas was responsible, along with an Israeli right-wing fringe, for derailing the so-called peace talks aimed at securing a two-state solution. But, as usual, to address such a question, we have to turn back to history. When the Declaration of Principles was signed between the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, and Israel in September 1993, it marked the end of the first Intifada, a mass Palestinian uprising that gave birth to Hamas as a political force. Many saw the Oslo Accords as a beacon of hope, a chance for peace in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but the road to failure was already being paved long before Hamas became a significant factor. So let's now rewind to 1974, when PLO chairman Yasser Arafat addressed the United Nations, famously offering peace while maintaining the right to armed struggle, following the issuance of the PLO's 10-point plan that was seen as paving the way to dialogue with Israel.
بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي فلا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي.
The Israeli response to this was rejection of what they called a terrorist group's peace offensive, expressed here by Israel's Yitzhak Rabin, who actually would later go on to sign the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat.
And so you have the statement of the Security Council chairman, which speaks about inviting the representatives of the terror organizations.
So, what changed? Well, by 1981, the Arab League had ratified the Fez initiative advocating for a two-state solution, which the PLO was ready to consider. However, Israel's response was not peace, but war. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, forcing the PLO to flee to Tunisia and killing around 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese. This conflict severely weakened the PLO, diminishing its capacity for both armed resistance and political leadership. As the Palestinian Intifada erupted in the late 1980s, the PLO struggled to take control of the uprising that was led locally inside the occupied territories. During the Intifada, the PLO also lost one of its biggest financial backers, Kuwait, after the PLO sided with Iraqi President Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War. Meanwhile, Israel faced a public relations crisis. Images of Palestinian youths throwing stones painted a David versus Goliath narrative that Israel couldn't combat. Recognizing the unsustainable economic and security cost of the occupation, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, infamously known as the bone breaker for his brutal crackdowns on non-violent protesters, finally agreed to a deal with the severely weakened PLO, leading to the creation of the Palestinian National Authority. This meant that the administrative and security role in the West Bank and Gaza, in what are known as Areas A and B, were taken off the hands of Israel, while the Israelis still maintained their full occupation of the majority of the territories in what is labeled as Area C. Better yet, the Palestinian Authority was funded by the US and EU, making Israel's occupation cost-free and enabling them to allocate their military resources elsewhere. Hamas, which had emerged during the Intifada, rejected the Oslo Accords along with other Palestinian factions. In 1995, following the massacre of Palestinians at the Ibrahimi Mosque in the West Bank by an Israeli extremist, Hamas carried out a series of suicide bombings. That same year, Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli, and by 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu had ascended to power, pushing the situation towards further violence and unrest, leading to the Second Intifada in 2000 that erupted after hopes for a two-state solution were crushed. Hamas has often been blamed for the failure of the peace talks due to its tactics, but Hamas wasn't the first to use suicide bombings. Palestinian Islamic Jihad initiated this tactic in 1989, with many groups contributing to the attacks throughout the 1990s. The peak of these attacks came during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, with Hamas being responsible for 39.9%, while Fatah, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, and other groups accounted for the rest. Focusing only on Hamas's violence ignores Israel's continued settlement expansion, apartheid policies, and ongoing occupation, all of which played the most significant roles in derailing the peace process. Even as Palestinian armed groups were crushed in the West Bank, particularly through Israel's Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, Hamas's resilience in Gaza forced Israel to reconsider its approach. By 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza, but not without securing its control over the West Bank, ensuring that the Palestinian Authority's security forces would be restructured and repurposed to have them play the role of faithful security coordination with Israel's occupation forces. Successive Israeli governments, including under Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud Party, continue to expand settlements and dismiss international law, all while blaming Hamas for the lack of progress. The narrative of a Hamas-Netanyahu radical alliance, as pushed by some liberal Zionists, is less about Hamas's actions and more about deflecting responsibility from Israel's policies. In a post-9/11 era, Islamic extremism became Israel's convenient boogeyman. And don't take my word for it. It was revealed in 2008 that Benjamin Netanyahu himself said that the September 11 attacks were good for Israel. Why? Because the Israelis had found their new Soviet Union in Iran and PLO and Hamas, arming it with two new public relations weapons. The first, to claim that the PA was not a rational negotiator for peace, and the second, to point to Israel's own Al-Qaeda-type problem, using Islamic terrorism as a distraction. That's why today we hear that October 7 was Israel's September 11. It's the same playbook that Netanyahu actually used himself to argue the US invade Iraq. Except the argument was flawed from the beginning. Al-Qaeda was a transnational terrorist entity whose founders were armed and trained with the help of the CIA to overthrow a Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, whereas Hamas emerged as a self-described national liberation movement. The only similarity here between these two groups is that they are both Muslim. In the end, while Hamas may have played a role, along with every other Palestinian armed movement, in allowing Israel to justify its hardline stance, it was not the primary reason for the failure of the Oslo peace process. The roots of that failure lie in a combination of factors, including Israel's strategic decisions, continued occupation, US unconditional support for Israel, and the broader dynamics of Palestinian resistance. If Hamas was the real problem, why is Israel still building settlements, killing civilians, and tightening its control over the West Bank, a territory where the Palestinian Authority preaches nonviolence and cracks down on its own people who resist Israeli occupation through force? This is because the ideology really doesn't matter. It is the fact that Palestinians are using armed resistance against the expansion of a settler colonial project on their land, as Palestinians have been doing since the Arab Revolt of 1936 and even before that. In fact, every major Palestinian political party, whether they be secular nationalists, Marxists, or Islamists, are considered to be terrorist groups by Israel, with the current exception of the mainstream branch of Fatah, which rules the Palestinian Authority. Yet prior to the Oslo Accords, Fatah was the primary group they blamed for a lack of peace. Now, as this series is focused on whether Israel really helped to create and prop up Hamas, there are still other questions that need answers. So be sure to stay tuned for part 3 of this series, where we'll delve deeper into Netanyahu's agenda after the conclusion of the Second Intifada and the Qatari aid money's role in this conflict. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more in-depth analysis.